Today's episode of the Mind Sculptors podcast is sponsored by TCG Player, your source for all your trading card game needs. Use our link in the description the next time you get your cards to help support the show. Today's episode is also made possible by our Patreon subscribers. If you want to support the show directly, head over to patreon.com/the Mind Sculptors and you can become part of the SCULPTY family today. Or if you don't want to do any of that, leave a like and comment on YouTube or a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts as an offering to Algorithm Jesus.
Let's see, what are we talking about today, Cal?
Well, if my text messages are any indication, I believe we are talking about tournament preparation. What you do when you are going to a event of Magic the Gathering that is a competitive event and features a bracket of some sort, and those sorts of things.
Yeah, that's probably the most awkward way you could have described it, but I love that for you so much.
If my brand is anything, it is finding the most obtuse and awkward ways of wording things.
Yeah. So, for those who are not aware, time-wise, when you are listening to this recording, the weekend prior will have been the GalaxyCon Oklahoma City Clash for Cash Invitational. So, for those who don't know, I won one of the qualifying events back in Richmond, which is ironically the only one I attended. Had to win the whole thing, and I got there. So, happy about that. But I get to go play cEDH for a signed Richard Garfield beta Time Twister, which
so cool.
Yeah, I really would like to win for sure.
Holy shit! This list you sent me for this event.
So
I'm assuming you know what I'm looking at.
So this is my most updated version of my what was recently called the Emra King list. Now I have made some adjustments, so I am trying the list without Emrakul. I have not been able to do much testing. I was very happy with Emrakul. I'm not necessarily saying it's bad or that you should cut it. I just want to try something else right now. So that's kind of the thing. And that's how you innovate, is you explore and change things and all that stuff. So I have been messing with this deck a lot today. I haven't had as much time to test as I traditionally would like, but this is kind of, a dual thing where it's like, I wanted to do this today because it's, I think prepping for tournaments and kind of getting a read on stuff is really important. And I figured it was a nice time to sort of talk about the adjustments I'm making and kind of the methodology behind them, all that stuff. So Cal, I'm going to send you the original. I'll send you the comparison page of the two decks. So right now, I've made 5 adjustments so far since the original list. So I swapped Badlands for Plateau just because strictly better color pairings, right? Actually just makes more sense with the deck. I think, I was building off other shells when I originally made the list, and, therefore I kept a mana base that I was 90% happy with, but I've gone in, made some fine tuning adjustments, all of that stuff. I added another land because you're a 5 color mana hungry deck, and I'm terrified of flooding, right? But genuinely, it's got to happen, right?
I think you also picked a good land to fill that extra land slot with, right? Tarnished Citadel. Tarnished Citadel is one of those
yes.
Honestly, I feel like it's hard to justify playing a 5 color deck without it a lot of times.
Yeah, I agree, right? So 5 color Terminaz can't afford it, right? This deck can. Ironically, though, I have put a little extra pressure on my life total because I did swap out Wheel of Fortune for Sylvan Library. For those who watched my tournament report on this deck, Wheel of Fortune was useless. Actually hated it every time I saw it. Was relevant in a single game and then rotted in my hand for multiple games. I was so done with it, right? So happy to have it gone. Sylvan Library, for those who know, I've been a Sylvan Library stand for a long time. So obviously adding Tarnished and Sylvan does make me anxious, like legit stresses me the hell out. But I want that 5-color land. I want that consistency. I want those things. And worst case scenario, I pay 3 into Kenrith, give myself 5 life to, stem some of the bleeding, right?
I think like the only other land, like if you're super, super anxious about like that 3 for it, is like the other option is Spire of Industry is another good option. We're
so light on artifacts, right?
That was what I was about to say. That is, you're only running 11, 12 artifacts if you're counting Sentinel. So it's like your count is pretty
if you
low.
Count Esper Sentinel and Phyrexian Metamorph, I'm on 13 hard artifacts, 14, 15 if you include Treasure Makers being Dockside. I guess 16 Dockside Lotho and Smothering Tithe, but that's playing a little bit of Calvin Ball with the artifact count there, So to me, like the artifact count is acceptable, but not enough. And if I want, if I'm looking for what's the choke point on a 5-color deck, I want my lands to come down early and provide the mana that I need them to provide, right? It's like why I don't even play Otawara in Sisay, right? Because of how important 5 colors is to that deck and like generating that, which is a very hot take among the Sisay community for that one. But, it's even a hot take to myself at times, right? But like this deck too, like I was even thinking about like, I want to add like an E-zone. And like, that's been a big thing for me right now is like, I think Flash is fucking busted in the current metagame. I think anything that gives Flash is broken. Like I want Born Upon the Wind. I want Emergence Zone, right? But these things don't fit in this deck, right? Mm-hmm. That's the big problem is that like those decks do really well when your deck has an overabundance of resources, right? Because then you can afford to throw away land and then like, boom, get you an instant speed, right? You can afford to pay 2 mana for an instant. But Kenrith is already a deck that struggles to keep interaction in general, right? Mm-hmm. So like really overcommitting to making that happen is like not something you can really afford to do, right? So that's kind of where we're at with the list right now, where and I guess I should go back for the couple of these changes. Anyways, all of that to be said, a little nervous about life totals going into this tournament. Yeah. The swap I made 15 minutes before this was I cut Decon for Entomb. Yeah. Now this one makes me nervous. But Decon is good in Kenrith in the fact that, a lot of the times if you go for an infinite mana combo, right, it's super easy to like consult for Emil or consult for Dockside, right? Because you don't really care as long as you have Kenrith on the battlefield, right? If you're going for one of your infinite mana lines, right? That doesn't account for the fact that you can get blown out. It doesn't account for the fact that like, a lot of things can really go wrong. I don't think Forbidden Tutors are bad in this deck. I also just like was coaching another person on this deck and they were like, yeah, dude, like when's the last time you actually thought about Thoracle in this deck? And I was like, that's a really good point, genuinely. To the point where I might even consider cutting Thassa's Oracle, right?
No, I love you. I don't think that's a great idea.
So what's the criticism there? Because I'm genuinely curious to hear what you have to say about that.
Because you're playing a mid-range pal, right? Like you're not in Sisay, right? Where Sisay is a thing where like the whole deck is trying to activate Sisay, pull out these things, and assemble this combo. Mm-hmm. Whereas with Kenrith, you're kind of trying to accrue enough overwhelming advantage to the point where you can go off. Right. And what Thassa's Oracle allows you to do is something that we've been talking about a lot in this format as a really important thing, which is the ability to just turn the corner when you need to. And I think that is something that when you cut that efficient of a combo, you are taking away your ability to just make that hard left turn if you need to.
Yeah, and so that's one of my hesitations, right?
Yeah.
The counter argument, I think, to that is I have Breach, I have Dockside, I have several layered Phantasmal Image Dockside lines, I have several layered Dockside lines with other creatures, including Emil, and I have Displacer Kitten Teferi as well, right? So like the win cons are in abundance, right? Like they
are, but I don't think you have any other win cons that are as compact as Thoracle Tainted Pact. Like it's 2 cards that require 2 spells to be cast, right? Which is something that no other of your combos can say.
I agree.
So
you could argue Emil Dockside, but that's got a lot more conditions
but I also
attached
think
to it.
you are opening up the surface area for where you can just get completely blown out when you take that out of your deck. Because if you get in a stacked out board state where there's a Draneth out, or there is a what's it called? Why can't I think of the Collector Oof or one of those types of cards?
Sure. I don't realistically expect to play.
You don't expect to see them, but those are things you need to be like aware of and cognizant. Or, you know, if there's a Graph Digger's Cage, or if somebody has, you know, Bowmasters or whatever, like any combination of these things, Thassa's Oracle allows you that ability to just be like, okay, sure, whatever, here's a Thoracle. And like, that is huge. And I also think there's another part of that is really important, is it's half of its creature. So it's it's a lot safer from a protection standpoint, in my opinion.
I disagree pretty heavily on that. I think that's Thoracle Consult is like if you go for reverse Thoracle, people know how to read it nowadays. Like I've yet to see anyone actually like fall for that in a very long time. I'm very happy cutting Consult, right?
I think Consult's a very safe cut. Like Consult's that card that I think, like, if you're not a food chain deck, or you're not a dedicated Thoracle deck, that is a very easy cut from a lot of decks.
Especially, and once again, we have so many fucking win cons in this deck, like many, and that makes me more comfortable with that cut, right? Like if I was down to like if I'm an Esper deck, right? Like there's no way in hell I'm touching T-Con, right?
Oh, for sure.
Right. So like this is
it's just saying, right? It's like, you know, we talk about, you just did that article a few weeks ago about like Tivit, right? Where it's like, that's a deck where it's like, I would never consider cutting Decon because you just need that density. Whereas here,
well, I've done it in Tivit, but
I think you can make an argument, but I still think you probably want to be on it. But regardless, like, I think the thing here is you need to be able to have that ability to just have a thing. Look at it this way. Somebody has a blind obedience. Your Dockside lines don't do shit.
No, I completely agree.
And so that's like one of the things that I look at it is, I think like Thoracle is just, it's another tool in your tool belt. You would just be replacing it with another tool in your tool belt. Having that tool be a win con, I think is worth it.
Yeah. And that's the thing. It's just, so I do agree with you. You know, there's also counter arguments with like, as soon as you get infinite mana, Kenrith is Clown Town easy to win with anything, right? Like literally anything. You can, you know, say there's a Bowmasters, right? You give yourself infinite life first, then you draw your deck. If you even want to go for the draw your deck line, which you don't have to because you can deck your opponents, right? There's just like, there's so many outs to the solutions that your opponents have, but I do agree. And especially in the case of like opposition agent, right? Like I want to be able to be like, cool, Tainted Pact Thoracle, like GG's, good job. I don't want to ever cut Tainted Pact, to be clear. Even if Thoracle left the deck, Tainted Pact is never leaving the deck. Tainted Pact is one of the best cards in the format.
You're just able to leverage it in this deck in a way that like other decks.
Like an instant speed tutor is like fucking busted, right? Like it is a card you cannot remove from your deck. And I think it is a card that is going to always kind of be there, right? But as I said, it's just food for thought. But I do especially agree with the like very stacked out, no Kenrith board state type of thing, which is like, sometimes the Magda just hits you with like with a God Pharaoh statue, right? And like you just got to reverse Thoracle and pray, right?
Well, and again, like sometimes people are just like, here's a Dauntless Dismantler, and you're just like, well, fuck. Right. So
right. And like that's why you know, another one of the cards that I'm going to talk about has made its way into the deck, right? Which is Etali, right? And don't get me wrong, Etali is not like the end all be all, the answer to all these things.
I love this ad. I think this is so good.
I think it really like, so Displacer Kitten plus Etali, obviously very cute synergy, very fun, all of that stuff, right? We have Entomb in the deck now, right? So what Emrakul did was break parity on a lot of those situations in which one person was very aggressively ahead, right? Where Etali here is a creature spell, hard to interact with, and then immediately goes, boom, I'm pressing my advantage. I have a bunch of clones, I have Displacer Kitten, I have Emil, right? There are multiple ways that I can get recursive Etali stuff going on, right? Not to mention if you clone, like for example, if you get like
you don't need to do that, right? Like it's worst case is it's a 7/7 with trample that is pressuring life totals, and then the other worst case is you have a fucking Blightsteel Colossus, right?
So right. Like, that Kenrith can give haste to and pump also.
Exactly. So it's like it's one of those things with that where I think that it's such a safe include. That it's like almost free. And you also have the ability with Kenrith to reanimate it.
Yeah. Survival, Entomb, right? Because one of the biggest problems I found with the deck is I'd have times where I I have Culling Ritual in hand, I have Survival of the Fittest, I have one creature, right? But if I Culling Ritual, I'm blowing up all the dockside count. And I'm what do I go get and reanimate here? Because Kenrith has a stupid amount of mana. I could just go boom, 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 get something going, right? And it's oh, okay, well, if I have a ton of black and green mana, let's just go cool, Entomb my Etali, bring it back to the field, maybe even have enough excess mana where I can go Etali Kitten, reanimate, go for it. Am I GG's ? Right? And it sounds like a lot of, it might sound Christmas landy, but genuinely, I don't think it is at all. And I think it's a rather realistic scenario, especially with Culling Ritual as a card, right? Just being able to double survival activation is come on, that is not that hard to get going.
No, this is a deck that I think is just when I think of a modern sort of comp to this, is it really makes me think of 4-color Omnath, right? Where it's just here are a pile of good cards that all synergize really well together. And that's really what this is. This is probably the most synergistic pile of cards I think I've ever seen.
And it's what you get in this deck that you don't get in a 60 card format, right? Or when you play something like Bean, right? Is it's actually closer to what you used to get with Yorion, right? When people were playing 80 card Bean, which is let's be real. 4-color Omnath has changed very little. Yeah. That's valid. But so when playing Yorion Bean, right? What you would get is all these cards that have a lot of synergy, right? You get your 3-mana Teferis, you get your Omnaths, you get your even the Wild Growths that draw a card, Abundant Harvest or whatever the fuck it's called. And you get all those cards, right? And they were very good on their own. They were all high card quality, right? But then, you add a little extra variance by throwing 20 more cards in your deck, and then suddenly 8 mana later, you play a Yorion and it's okay, cool. Hey, you remember all these busted cards? What if they did everything that they do a second time and also got all their ETBs and I can also blink this guy later on or bounce him back to my hand and do all this nonsense again. It's oh, wait a minute. I lose. This is done, right? And I think that's what Kenrith is, right, in this deck, right? Yeah.
I really liked the Emrakul, and I'm going to be honest. Yeah. Actually, when I was editing your video and I was going through this whole thing, I was I don't think this is the deck for Emrakul. I actually think Tivit is the deck for Emrakul.
Interesting. I don't hate that.
Tivit can take advantage, use Emrakul in the way that very few decks are able to. And this, my whole reasoning for being I like Emrakul. I was just and I think it's good generically, but I was just it doesn't take advantage of ETBs. It's a catch trigger. And I think with a deck like this, you want to be able to just pull shit out of your graveyard.
Yep. No, I completely agree. And that's the busted part of Kenrith, right? Is getting it on. And one of the changes I made compared to Kenrith lists that have been doing well is I do focus more on Kenrith, right? I think Kenrith is busted. I think Kenrith is busted in the way that Sisay is busted, where you don't have to put a lot in the stack, but when you put that thing on the stack, it's okay, this game's on. Let's go. What are we doing here? And I think you see that with the list, right? It does a lot of that work of okay, cool. As soon as I get a creature in the yard, we're just sort of holding guns to each other's head and just being please tap down, see what happens. Right? And that's the stuff. And I think Etali contributes more to that game plan, right? That's why I eventually ended on it. Because I originally put Etali in there. I was this is fun, synergistic. And I was no, get it out of here. I don't think it's doing the thing. But the situation that has come up for me a good amount, which is I can put something in the graveyard. I really want to get excited about something I'm putting in the graveyard, and Dockside is just not working in this one moment, right? So what's the thing? And now I have an answer. This is the thing, right?
I like the Entomb ad too. I think just having that 1 mana, be able to put your best reanimation target into the graveyard.
Yeah, and you know what the thing that sold me was, and I wasn't really thinking about this when I was originally thinking about Entomb, was that sandbagging Entomb is huge, right? And that's the thing I needed to play the deck and get those 2 tournaments in to understand, which was oh, I can just hold 6 mana, have Kenrith out, look like nothing's going on, and then at some point go oh, cool, you have a lethal threat on the stack. You've you're midway through a breach line, whatever, right? I can go cool, Entomb Dockside.
Or somebody Dockside. Just top deck tutored, right? You can just hop on top of that and go grab it, right? There's so many things.
Oh, with Etali, you mean? Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Because you can just on top of the stack, just be Entomb, reanimate, boom. And
oh, hey, I'm gonna go, Tymna attack, Tymna trigger on the stack, they just Imperial sealed, oh god, what's going on, right? And you can be hey guys, let me into him right now. I'm gonna snipe
somebody
that.
just worldly tutor for Dockside, right? And you're just like, sick. Thanks for the Dockside, buddy.
Thank you very much. I will take that happily. Thank you. Right? Like that is 100% it. And in what Etali does that I really appreciate is when the Dockside count is low.
Dino,
yeah,
nuts.
Trust me. Spoiler. I've got some Dino Pilled merch in the bank for the Comedian channel later on. I've hired a wonderful artist who Callahan and I will hopefully be working on with other stuff. But yeah, we're Dino Pilled for sure. But like one thing that's really important and what people have traditionally played Selvala for in the past, right? Is Selvala is, as long as Kenrith has 8 power, a combo with Kenrith where if your Dockside count is low, you can like reanimate Image, Legend Rule, die, like keep going through that loop and like do a bunch of stuff, right? And while Etali doesn't generate mana, what you basically create is a situation where you're like every 5 mana is 4 spells with Image, right? Which is pretty damn good in my opinion.
Yeah. And the other thing is too, like it's also just like generically high value. I don't think you have to be taking it like this is one of the things I think so many people get into this headspace where it's like everything in my deck has to like, especially with reanimation targets, has to win me the game like right away. Whereas I think it's a lot better to take the page out of like other formats where you can like reanimate a fucking Archon of Cruelty and just be like, deal with it, figure it out. Right. This is one of those types of cards.
Yeah, I agree. So like, I'm pretty sold on Etali. We'll see if it BTFOs me when I play the event. Right. So let's talk about the event, right? Because this is probably going to color a little bit of this, right? Of like a lot of my decisions going into it. And I guess like how I even got to, I'm running Kenrith back. Right. So obviously my results with Kenrith were very good, right? I took it to a 56 and 70 something player tournament. And top forward both ended up winning one of them, right? So like, obviously I'm feeling very confident with the deck, feeling like it has a lot of explosive potential, can grind really well. Like there's so much modality to Kenrith, right? You know, people talk about me being a political player, right? Kenrith is one of the ultimate political toolboxes to ever exist, right? You have the ability to hold up mana and use the flexibility of Kenrith. You know, you can snipe a Thoracle player with Consult on the stack. You can reanimate. You know, I had a game where I reanimated someone else's Hullbreaker Horror so they could double counterspell to stop the blue farm player winning, right? Like
there's also like an added layer to it that I don't think enough people realize is like if somebody plays a threat and there's somebody at the table that you really want to like pressure their life total, you're just like, okay, 1 red, all creatures have haste, go ahead and attack them now.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Like there was a point at King's Court where I screamed Kenrith Combat King because I got so excited that a Crom player attacked into Italian, and I was like, hey bro, how you want that Italian to be a little beefy? Why don't you declare it as a blocker? And they're like, what? And I was like, pump counter. And they're like, oh yeah, sick. Yeah, block Crom. Right? Like it was free. It's free. And I had mana up and I wasn't doing anything else with it. And I was like, let's go. Kenrith is the combat king, man. There's so much stuff it can do. And it's got that flexibility, and I really appreciate that part of it. I like having a commander that makes me feel like I'm playing Magic, right? Like it is up to me as the pilot to use it to its best potential, right? Same thing with Sisse, right?
And like generally speaking, I feel like those are the decks that you thrive with. Yeah. Because those are the decks where it's like if I am the one who elevates the deck, and the deck elevates like your ability to like choose things really well. Those are decks that I've traditionally think you have performed really well with.
Right. And I always tell people this. It's like if you ever hear people talk about like tennis players or even like swordsmen, right? Like people who specialize in these things, they always talk about how their arm feels complete when they have these items, right? Like lacrosse players, tennis players, like hockey players, all of them, like they feel like it is an extension of their body, right? And when you become that in tune with your instrument, right, that is something that can help a lot. And it comes up in cEDH all the time where I'm like, look, you are a sick player. I think you're really good. But you are a guitar player who's sitting there banging on the drums. What are you doing? You know what I mean? Like, I literally played against a player. I think it was like the Top Deck Expo, right? They were playing Rogsite and they're playing it like Blue Farm, and I was like, my brother, like, yeah, I was like, you are playing the most responsible Rogsite I've ever seen in my life, and not taking advantage of the times when you should be jamming. Like, play blue farm, you're going to whoop people, right?
Yeah.
And like I later saw them on Attraction, and they looked much more comfortable playing that deck, right? And I was like, yeah, like there we go. You're playing mid-range, playing responsibility, playing interaction, like, and you're doing it in a way in which you are gaining advantage slowly over time. You know, arguably Attraction is still a little parasitic, but you know, it is what it is. But you know, it's all. But that's one of those things, right? So you definitely want that deck that is going to be the extension of you, right? Like that is, I'm going into a high pressure tournament, right? Like this is an item for the prizing that is worth a considerable amount of money, right? Like this is nothing to scoff at, right? And every time I go into a tournament like this, I want to bring a deck that basically says like, I'm putting up, like this is me trying to manifest the best version of my run, right?
Let me propose this, run that past you to see if you like think about this take. This feels, you've talked a lot on this channel and on your channel about how much you want to revive Dawnwaker. I think this is it. Like, I think this is new. I think this is like what modern Dawnwaker is.
I agree. There's a reason I haven't worked on Dawnwaker in tournaments a lot lately, and it's because Sisay and now Kenrith, respectively, have felt like they are just able to articulate the same play patterns in a much more efficient way, given the current shape of the metagame. Right now, things can change. All of that stuff. Bowmasters goes away. Maybe Dawnwaker becomes a little bit more playable, right? Because that is a deck that thrives in a non-Bowmaster setting, right? It still can see play. I could still bring it to a tournament tomorrow and feel very comfortable with it, but it won't have the same amount of tools, right? And importantly, what this deck, Kenrith, and what Sisay do that Dawnwaker doesn't do is Dawnwaker can never win without putting a spell in the stack, right? It is always necessary to put a spell on the stack. Well, and that's why in this metagame, it's huge.
That's why Congo and Cobble and all those people that worked on the like King K rule version for a really long time were so high on it, is because you could just slam a rule of law and then never cast another spell and win the game.
Well, after Kenrith, yeah. Right, because you literally go like, all right, cool, move to combat, trample and haste, cool, counters, yeah, all right, pass, right? Like, and that was it. That was the game plan. And they're like, oh, cool, can we overcommit to blowing out Kenrith? And you're like, cool, well, I've sandbagged 5 counter spells this whole time in case, you know, the one thing I had to answer, which was an answer to my Kenrith or an answer to my rule of law, I will counter you. Right, and like, yeah, and like that was the K rule, plan for sure. And what I like about this deck is like, I'm not the problem all the time, right? Like it genuinely, like it is correct to deal with other things at the right times. But in the meantime, I will set up my engines and try and get myself to a position where I am comfortable, right? And it's a deck that can survive a lot, right? It has that resiliency. It is a deck that is able to pivot and keep us in the game in situations where sometimes you gotta get your hands dirty, right? You gotta, like, once again, I never want to reanimate someone else's Hullbreaker Horror, but like that is a play I had to make to survive a game, right? And it was ugly and it was not a good time, right? But yeah, it's sometimes you got to get your hands a little bit dirty, and Kenrith gives you the option, right? When no other deck can make a move like that, right? To be able to stem off a win, right? 4 counter spells in, you're like not able to do anything, but Kenrith gives you that flexibility in that modality, right? Which is why I'm leaning heavier into it.
So here's my question for you, and I think I know the answer, and I'm pretty like comfortable with it, and I think that it's a pretty good choice generally, but there's no Orcus Bowmasters in this list. What's the that was one of my cuts. You took it out with your Rogsai list as well. Is this kind of a similar situation?
Yeah. So I took it out for sure. Basically, the idea is right now we are playing in an environment where Bowmasters is the expectation, right? I don't think I have too many creatures in this deck that really folds a Bowmasters. I guess like, it's arguable, like they can snipe off my dorks, some of my value pieces, right? All of that stuff. I am not without answers. I have removal. I have clones. But I think the format is warped around Bowmasters, and therefore it's a less valuable card, right? People are planning every single one of their decks to a Bowmasters reality, right? And I think Bowmasters is really great when you're playing wheels, when you can back it up with other pieces, right? Like in like a blue farm, I think it's uncuttable, right? But in the same way that like some people cut Drannith from Kenrith and stuff like that, is like, I don't think it's pushing my game plan at all, right? It's not giving me draws. It's not giving me any sort of advantage here. I'm happy to make a copy of it at some point, but like, there's very few scenarios where someone's just jamming a wheel and I'm like, oh yeah, let me survival of the fittest into that. Like, I just don't think that's a realistic scenario that like comes up a ton, right? And if that is a scenario that comes up, like I will take game actions to do other things, right? I don't think it's Flash is saving me at all. I think, it does once again provide incremental value, right? But I have no way to truly take advantage of it. And I think if you're playing one wheel, it's a little bit differently. But seeing as how shite wheel was for me, I don't really want a scenario where I'm playing this card that I'm unhappy with for another card that I'm middling happy with at best, right?
No, I think that's super valid.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things where I think we kind of, I've talked about this a little bit before, but the whole like, cutting down, like tearing down some of the the idols, so it were.
Yeah, kill your heroes. Absolutely.
Kill your heroes. Thank you for efficiently saying what I was attempting to say. No, I think that's one of the things is, you're pushing back against Thus's Oracle. And I think that is a place we want to be at. Right. I mean, I've very often been like, there are decks that are red where I'm like, listen, baby, we don't want to be playing Breach. It does not line up with our game plan whatsoever. Yep. And I've cut my, cut my teeth. Is that the expression? Whatever. I've come up by always challenging these staples, right? Like there are like, not to sound a little conceited here, but like there are definitely cards that are inclusions and exclusions because of work I've put in this format, right? And I'm never afraid to challenge that in this thing, and like challenge those deck building philosophies that like, sometimes we've had hands in creating, right? There was a period of time where like blue was so low in the format and everyone's like, I can't believe you're not playing Veil of Summer and Carpet of Flowers. And it's like, okay, cool. Like, great. And you know how many wins I got by not having dead cards in my deck, right? Like, and the amount of times I've seen people like fizzle with those cards, not saying they're not good right now. This is a meta game where they are back to being very good, right? But during the stacks meta, right, when that was pre-Bowmasters, it was actually like bad to play those cards, right? And so like never being afraid to challenge cards is a good thing, right? I was talking with the Malcolm Kedis player the other day, and they were like, yeah, it might seem controversial, but I don't play Breach in this deck. And I was like, good, you have a tutor and then 3 dead cards in your deck most of the time. Yeah. Right. Like, yeah, absolutely. Like, it's sometimes these cards, you're right, they're held up like idols. They don't play your Sylvan Libraries, play a bunch of other random cards that like work well in this deck, but don't work great. But it's like Kenrith is literally a deck where you have to eschew so many staples. Like literally look at the way the deck's built. Think about how many different green cards could be in this deck. Think about the fact that I'm not on Neoform or Eldritch Revolution, any of those pieces. I'm not on Invasion of Ikoria, which is played in every green deck, right? There's so many staples that I am not even touching. Right. One of the biggest upgrades I ever did to Kinnan was cutting Neoform and Eldritch Revolution because it's so clunky with that deck and you want a board state. Right. So there's a lot of these adaptations, these flexibilities, these choices that, you can make to really push against the status quo. And, I'm not saying these cards aren't good because like, guess what? I'm not touching fucking Rhystic Study. That card's a really damn good card. Right. But like, it also doesn't mean I have to play every staple. Right. And I think that's like challenge every card in the lens of what you're trying to do, right? And decks can be multifaceted. They can have multiple lenses, right? But if it doesn't fit into the lenses, right? Like I'm not trying, Bowmasters doesn't help me win at instant speed, right? It doesn't help me set up my advantage engines. It doesn't help me get my game plan online. It doesn't help me get Kenrith. It doesn't help me get any of my combos, right? Like for me, like it's a strikeout on all those things. And I don't feel like it disrupts my opponent enough to earn the spot of a card like a Dauntless or Bowmasters. Or sorry, not Bowmasters, Drannith, right? No, I really like this deck, and I think that this is going to be a good. I think one of my hottest takes might be I think that this might be one of the most well positioned decks in the format at the moment because of its ability to do all of that. But I feel like I've been saying Kenrith is a top 4 to 5 deck for a while now. Yeah.
I also think I completely agree with you. And I also just think it's difficult, right? Like I just talked about how many branches exist, right? Like I played an entire tournament where it was strictly optimal to use the life gain ability and I completely missed it because I was so focused on every other mode on that card, right? And like could have easily just gained 5 life and not worried about a single card. That was a problem for me, right? Yeah. So like these things come up. It's a toolbox commander with 5 separate modes, not to mention the cards in your hand, not to mention the political axis, not to mention you can worry about your opponent's things as well as your own things. It's like the decision paralysis is real. So you have to be comfortable with making pivots, making hard choices, making those choices that are going to get you the game, right? But it's not easy. I'm not gonna, it's a very strong deck, but it is not an easy deck. And that's
for sure.
Like the flag I'm planting, which is like good deck, very strong, very difficult.
Very much so.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, and then let's see. Is there anything in the sideboard that like jumps out to you and stuff like that?
Yeah, there's like a couple things in here that I think are interesting. I think the card that I am pretty much generally pretty high on is Bring to Light. I've historically been a very big advocate of that card. Mm-hmm. I think this is a deck not to play it in, though.
Agreed.
I very much look at this and I'm like, what are you Bring to Lighting for, right?
Yeah, it's like a Mailer Dockside 90% of the time, right? Or like Culling Ritual, right?
Yeah. But I mean, like, I like the idea of Spellskite. I do think that it is probably a little bit too defensive.
Yeah.
For what this deck is going for. But I mean,
and don't get me wrong, Spellskite's goated, right? Like it's one of the, I think, especially in the format in the current iteration with everything being so mid-rangey, I think the card's like actually insane. But like, I agree. It just feels like card 101 for me a lot of the time.
Well, and that's the thing is I think you're playing a deck that is so top heavy that it can just kind of be fine without it. Whereas a deck like Najeela, I would not leave my house without Spellskite personally.
Wholeheartedly agree. Here's one I'm going to throw out to you that I've been struggling with, which is Dauntless versus Blind Obedience.
Okay.
I don't know. I had Dauntless in there with the concept that if games get grindy, I can always pop Dauntless, bring it back with Kenrith, right? Like that's the big upside to me. Right.
I think that's a pretty good upside. I think the thing you have to kind of weigh here is are you a deck that cares about creatures entering tapped? Because if not, then Dauntless is the thing to go. But if you feel like you're going to be going in and wanting to like hit people, or you're worried about people coming in with like hasty creatures or whatever, then Blind Obedience is probably where you want to be. But I do think that this synergizes with what you're doing a little bit more.
Yeah. So some of the other ups and downs, right, is that Blind Obedience is obviously more resilient, right? Creature removal is much easier to come by than it is, non-creature. Although, with Besage in the format, there's technically a conversation about balance there and which of which is more relevant, right? The other thing is, and this is something that I think I appreciate about this deck, is that I actually don't mind my opponent's creatures coming in untapped, because it's harder for decks, and this is something I was just thinking about when you brought this up, Najeela and Tymna and Blue Farm and all of those decks that want my opponents to be tapped down so that they can feed a bunch of advantage off of them. I don't want them doing that. I will happily have all of their stuff come in untapped so that it is hard to do combat, because at the end of the day, Kenrith is the combat king, right? Like, and if I need to get in, I'm paying 1 red to give trample and crunching over whatever you have to block. Right. So that's my thing of like, maybe like you bring up a really good point there that helps me feel more valid in that decision. I'm just worried about removal, right? That's actually straight up the thing, right?
I mean, it's a 1/4, right? Like, I think that that's going to be the removal I would be the most worried about is like Abrupt Decay and TBH. Very few people are on green these days.
Right. It's like the Etali stuff that concerns me a little bit, right? Which is like, I already think like a pretty decent matchup for us in general, but like, like they have weird cards like Rending Volley and Pyrokinesis and stuff like that. And it comes to mind because not necessarily that I expect to see a bunch of Etali, but it's more so like those cards that deck's introducing to the meta more and more are pieces that like maybe I'm a little more concerned about, right?
Well, okay. Worst case scenario, somebody tries to Rending Volley it and you're like, cool, pop this for 0, right? Like, I think you can still grab enough advantage off of it that it like
100%.
If somebody tries to go after it, you can still punish them for it.
Yeah. And unlike other decks too, the activated extort ability is not nearly as relevant because we have Kenrith, right? Like I think it's less of a very real clock because Kenrith is just, once again, that commander that just, if you have stuff, it allows you to do everything, right? If you're scrapped on resources and all you have is Kenrith, you're SOL, right? Which is, good and bad at times. But yeah, no, I do agree. I think at the end of the day, I want my opponent's stuff to come in untapped, all that stuff. I don't think I'm losing to Kiki Jiki anytime soon, or dual caster sometimes, but like
if you lose to a dual caster,
that's on me. That's on me.
Is what it is, right? Like it's like, oops. I think that maybe there's an argument for Touch the Spirit Realm as probably one of the most versatile removal spells.
Yeah. That like that touch slash sky turtle slot, right? Like that sort of nature to it. Now Kenrith reanimates stuff enough that I'm not like too pressed about that, right? But like,
here's my argument for it is that touch is really good in the situation where you're like, I need to get Kenrith down so I can start getting my engine going. But I also am okay with this Draneth Magistrate, generally speaking. And touch is really good in that scenario because it gives you that opportunity to just make it go away for a little bit, bring your thing in. And it's like the thing that, what was it that Brian did in the Marchesa event that you guys were playing in, right? Where he just dressed down. We thought it was going to be a game-winning turn, and it was just to play Crom, and then passed. And it's like, those are situations where I think like this is a deck that can do that very comfortably. And I think that's a real good reason to play touch.
No,
I don't know what you're cutting for touch.
That's the other problem. Like I also really want like a 2-mana counterspell too, right? But like what do I even touch? You know what I mean? Because like I thought about Miscast, I thought about Fierce, but like each of those has a different utility that I appreciate. Fierce is also a new inclusion, to be clear. I don't think we kind of mentioned that. Gilded Drake got swapped for Fierce.
I personally don't like Fierce, but I understand it. I personally think you could probably just play like a mana drain and be just as happy with it.
So here's this is the thought process I've been going through. So I'm really glad you brought this up, right? Is I have a triangle right now of things that are filling that spot, and a Miscast and Fierce are also sort of the card that's interchangeable in this conversation, right? So it's Miscast slash Miscast slash Fierce Guardianship, right? And then one corner is mana drain, right?
Yeah.
And the other corner is oh my god, what am I thinking? I mean, no, maybe I'm talking about Fierce. Mana drain, Fierce, Miscast.
That is 3.
Delay, maybe it's the other one I'm thinking of. Yeah. So the idea is, right, so we're worrying about this dynamic of like, okay, Miscast, much better in the early game, very good when I'm sort of choked on mana, does not need Kenrith, et cetera, right? The mana drain slash delay spot, and that's maybe where I'm thinking, is like that 2-mana interaction spot, like very good at answering kind of whatever problem comes in. Kenrith is notoriously a deck that is a little lower on interaction, right? So me having a piece that sort of contradicts that ideology, I kind of like that, right? Touch is sort of also in this conversation too, right? It's that 2-mana interaction piece. It's like, I like it. I have Abrupt Decay in the spot now, and I feel very comfortable with that choice, but you know, it's a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. It sucks that you can't bounce something necessarily. Our only real bounce effect is our 3-mana Teferi and our Cyclonic Rift, right? So like those are our bounces, right? And then we kind of get to this discussion of like, okay, Fierce Guardianship is really good because I've mentioned Kenrith is a priority for this version of the deck, right? And I do, unlike traditional Kenrith, I do play Kenrith more than I think a lot of pilots, right? Especially once again, given the current shape of the meta, where I think the strength of the decks lies, it involves Kenrith being out on the field, right? And it makes it more easy for me to make him a priority and not feel like I'm time walking myself when I make that, right? Like I don't want to like have to pact when the Kenrith is out and then completely tap out, so it doesn't like I've double time walked with 5 mana, right? So I like Fierce for that purpose. Obviously, there are major downsides to it, right? Which I don't think we even really need to like break down. It's the obvious thing is like it's 3 mana when Kenrith isn't out, right? And then there's the 2-mana interaction spot, which is like, well, if I'm already holding up all this mana to like do multiple things and activate Kenrith a bunch, right? Like having the flexibility of having a counter spell that just says like enough, right? Is good and solid. I think double blue for mana drain is asking a lot. I think it's greedy. And I agree that like it's something I've thought about a lot, but like at the end of the day, I keep going back to this mana base has already been one where I'm like, I'm adding a land more than I think I really necessarily need because of how much the color choke is real. Right.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. I was gonna say, so delay is kind of like the one I'm thinking about more so in that spot. And it's a matter of like, Kenrith versus not Kenrith, right? Like how comfortable I am with each of these spots. And it does the Sisse thing where it's like you've got to like really make very intentional choices about which pieces of interaction you are using in these situations, right?
Mm-hmm. I think here's my perspective on this. This is a really fun episode because I think a lot of people are getting a behind the scenes look of what like you and I just kind of like chatting is like.
Yes.
Because a lot of this is not even me like performing. It's just us talking back and forth. Is my like thought here is I don't love miscast in a deck that runs this few counter spells.
Okay.
And the reason being is that when you're in a deck like this, where your answers are very limited, you want those answers to answer as many things as possible.
Agreed completely.
And I think miscast is really good in a very particular meta, and it's really good in control decks. And then other than that, unless you're on, you know, the like 10, 12, 13 counter spells, I think that you could probably be on a spell that answers more things.
I agree. The 1 mana part is the priority for me.
I think that's very real. You know, that's, you know, I tend to like spell pierce more personally. I know that you don't like spell pierce. But
honestly, should I like, is this a spell snare slot?
It might be a spell snare slot. I think
because it is definitive, right? Yeah. Like,
and I think that's kind of my issue with miscast, right? Is I think that like it's very good in the early game, but again, you're playing a high number of not counter magic. And so in the early game, do you want to be sitting on a miscast or do you want to be developing your board?
Yeah.
And would you rather that be, you know, like a force of negation?
I mean, you know how much I love Spell Snare, right? Like Spell Snare is a very powerful card. It definitely comes with its downsides, right? So I'm just worried about the times where I'm like, I'm going to do my thing. I'm at a pinch for mana and they're like, cool, swords or dockside, right? It's like, fuck me. That's the
where
worst.
I like Fierce Guardianship. I do think it's really good here. I think miscast might just be like
worse
a little bit too turbo brained. If that makes sense.
It's not necessarily. It's like actually for me, the reason I play miscast is anti-turbo brain, right? Like
sure.
It's for cutting off those decks.
But that's what I mean. Is I think it's a little too over focused on that when we're in this mid range meta, and I think the mid range meta is going to need more delays, mana drains, spell snares than miscasts.
I agree. It is Kenrith's weak spot, right? Like those decks, those are really hard for Kenrith to attack early on. And maybe that's even more reason, right? Because here's exactly what we were talking about earlier. Taking a card, putting it in the lens of why am I playing this card, right? Because my answer to why am I playing this card is like, I want an answer early to be able to hit off the turbo decks, to be able to hit them where it hurts, right? And like,
I gotta say
is that, right?
I gotta say, you bragged on yourself a little bit earlier. I do gotta say, I want to brag about myself just a little bit here. I do think one thing that I'm very good at is asking those questions of like, okay, so why do we want this, right? And I think this
is why I come to you for these things. Like if anyone watches this podcast for any amount of time, like Cal and I are very close. We also heavily disagree on a lot of stuff, right? As you could tell by our rhetorical conversation, but our conversation's productive. And that's what I really appreciate about you, is that like there are times where you come at me with a heater and I'm like, cool, that was definitely a heater. But the reasoning you threw the heater out to me was because you have it based in this thing. And I like that. You know what I mean?
And I think that's why when I look at this and I just like kind of think about the way this deck is playing, I would either want like a delay instead of miscast. Or a spell snare instead of miscast. Or if I'm feeling really frisky, a touch the spirit realm instead of miscast. I think those fit the bill a little bit better.
I think the choice makes me nervous no matter what, right? Because like I know for a fact I'm gonna lose because I don't have one of the other ones, right? And that's just gonna be it, right? And like,
this is one of those things where in sports, I think about like with football. There are things where you're just going to be like, listen, they have a wide receiver who is faster than our cornerback. We're not winning that game. we're going to try and minimize what we're going to handle, what we can handle, and we're just going to accept the things that we can't deal with. And it's just like one of those things where you kind of have to accept things sometimes.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with you, right? Like there's going to be a silence on the stack. I'm going to look at Spell Snare and be like, fuck you. But there's also going to be times where like, I agree. Like, it's just like, there's also a silence on the stack and you're like, cool, pay 3 more. And they're like, sick. I still have a Dockside in hand. You're like, you got me.
Well,
right.
And even then there's going to be other times where people are like, here's a Dockside. And you're like, cool. Wish this was anything else. Right.
And this is also one of the things that for me, my understanding of the metagame that I'm going into as well, I think does sort of play into it here, right? Like, I think I'm going to be playing against a bunch of folks who, I mean, these are all either people who qualify with the last chance qualifier or they're invitational winners, right? So it's like playing a very loaded top 16 from the very beginning, right? So I have to realize that like there's a certain amount of demographic here of people who are not going to be playing as wide a variance of decks as you would find in a traditional tournament because this is an invitational, right? And so to me, Spell Snare feels a lot more like an invitational card than it does like a miscast, right? Like I don't expect to just have everybody being like slam, 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 right? Like I expect the Grand Abolishers and the Docksides and the Breaches and like all of these very powerful cards that are going to put me on the back foot and make me need a very meta-specific answer, you know?
Yeah.
He said hopefully.
I think that makes total sense to me personally. Like I again, like I think that like miscast, like there is a reason why in my Tivit list, like I'm definitely playing miscast. Well, I might not be on miscast because I can't find my fucking copy, but that's a separate issue, separate
conversation.
But like that's one of the things where it's like a deck like that where I'm very comfortable in Tivit being like land, maybe a value engine or something and passing with like a mana up. Kenrith, I don't feel like is that deck, right? Where it's especially in the early game, you're trying to establish an engine. So that's kind of how I feel about it.
3,000,000% agree with you there. I think the other card that like maybe is in that spot is like just Dispel, right? But I think Dispel is another one where it's like I've loved that card historically. It's much better in the counterspell fights in the later part of the game, but cEDH is so much more complicated now, right? There are like it hits like a Mind Break Trap, right? But like doesn't do shit against like a Flusterstorm. It doesn't stop your Otawars and your Besejus and like these things that are like there's so many nuanced pieces of interaction, right? And, you know, the reason I've been on miscast traditionally over the past like 6 months compared to I used to be a big Dispel person, right, is the fact that sorceries would kill me when I had a Dispel rotting in my hand, right? I would lose to a Culling Ritual or a Toxic Deluge or a Demonic Tutor or a Beseech the Mirror or like the Praetor's Grasp. I can go on forever, right? But I agree the downside of miscast in a deck that can't really afford that many counterspells did come up as well, right? Yeah.
Well, and I mean, that's again, why I kind of come back to it's like, if you're playing the control deck, ship it, right? But you're not. And that's why I lean closer to the hard counter spells personally. Just because of the fact that I think that they are so, the utility on them is so wide that I think they just kind of pay for themselves. But
Agreed. This was a very productive conversation. I think like it seems crazy, right, to like hyper focus on like 2 counter spells, right? But like these are things that count, like they really do. And you set yourself up for these things, and like it's 100 card variants. I may never fucking see these cards, right? But I've been the champion of Spell Snare for like 2 years longer than anyone else in this format. I genuinely think. I think
as long as I've known you, you've been a champion of Spell Snare.
and it has never been more relevant than it is in the current metagame. And if I'm expecting to play against good players, right, they are going to engage in play patterns that involve these 2-mana spells, right? They are going to lead the Grand Abolisher on their game-winning turn, right? They are going to put a lot of these situations where like there is something very threatening to me on the stack, right? Like a Dockside or a Grand Abolisher or any of these very terrifying permanents, right? And I'm going to need an answer for them. And that's my hope, is that I'm targeting that demographic specifically, right?
I feel very targeted right now. No, I definitely like where this is at. I think this is really solid going into this tournament. I think that generally speaking, I think this is pretty solid. This is a list that will probably be playing on MTGO at some point because of the fact that I think that it like, I mean, this feels like it is the intersection of both of our play styles.
Sure.
Because it's just like the way this type of deck plays is very like it leans on the Kinnan and the Dawnwaker part that you are used to, and it leans also on the more control-y and mid-rangey parts of like Timnath Thrasios and Tivit that I'm used to, and I just think that this is really, really hot. So I'm rooting for you this weekend.
Thank you.
If people want some tournament prep, and want to hire you to do what we're doing right the fuck now, how can people do that?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, hyper analyzing small decisions like this to set myself up for victory in a lot of these situations has gone well for me. I have a pretty solid resume at this point for cEDH, and if you would like help in that specific sphere, you can feel free to contact me. ComedIanMTG@gmail.com, @ComedIanMTG over on Twitter and Instagram, and Comedian_MTG over on Discord. We do gameplay coaching, which is I'll sit down with 4 people, they'll do a game. I'm keeping notes, I'm taking all that stuff. And those have been insanely helpful lately. Very, very happy with how those are turning out, and a lot of people are really happy engaging in them. A lot of people come back and do it again. And then we have the one-on-one coaching, which is deck help, which is help with politics, help in getting the right deck for you starting out in the format. What resources do I need? All of those things that you are in need for if you want to start the fast track to success in cEDH. You can find me at any of those places we talked about, and Cal's really good about including my links. So thanks.
Of course. Every time you do the pitch, I do a little giggle, because if it was like any other context, like if it was like you were selling anything else, it'd be like, alrighty. But no, I think what you sell is like super valuable, and I think it's super helpful, and I think that people should absolutely look into it. And you know, Ian will give you the hard talks. Listen, Papa Ian will sit you down and be like, listen, son, yeah. He'll put his hand on your shoulder and just pat you and go, this isn't the time. And
oh my goodness.
If you want to support the podcast, you could go over to patreon.com/the Mind Sculptors, and you can sign up for our Patreon and support us monetarily. And if you don't want to support us monetarily, fuck you. But actually, no, I get it. Not everybody can do that. If you would just leave a subscribe and a like, maybe a comment for engagement, we would greatly appreciate that. I wish I could emphasize to people how helpful comments are. It's so huge for our back end stuff. And a huge part of what people look for when they are wanting to jump on the show and, you know, sponsor a podcast potentially. And or a YouTube channel by neither of us do that shit, right? Like,
no, all that helps a ton, everybody. And like, genuinely, there's been so much support since I've jumped on this podcast, and generally thank you for everyone who helps to make this happen. Thank you to Cal for obviously editing these and being the main source behind the Mind Sculptors. There's a lot of really great stuff in our community, and those folks who keep showing up and spreading positivity are really appreciated. We've met so many amazing people when we've done signings and things like that. And even when I'm doing solo signings for my channel, I've had people come up and be like, I love the Mind Sculptors. You guys are great. And like, I genuinely, it means the world to us. It means the world to me personally, I can say at the very least.
No, I fucking hate it. I don't know what you're talking about. Fucking drive
I like speaking for people. Okay. No, but we like, I can't say enough how much it's appreciated. It's huge. It's really cool.
I was literally thinking earlier, I went grocery shopping this morning, and I was literally thinking to myself, it's like, I bought a bag of those like Nerds gummies. And I was just thinking to myself, I was like, man, if I could talk to teenage Caleb and be like, listen, life, you're going to be living exactly you will be so thrilled with what your job is going to be in 15 years. I would have been stoked beyond belief. But yeah, thank you all for listening. We'll be back next week. I don't think, 2 weeks we'll be doing our power rankings, I think. And so look forward to that. And then next week we'll be back with more Sculpty Boys action. We'll let you know how Ian did down in OKC.
Absolutely.
For everybody here at the Mind Sculptors, we'll see ya.
Bye.